Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Dealing with Feelings. I'm very excited to share my interview with Dr. Angela Duckworth. Angela is the author of the best-selling book, Grit, and a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. In our conversation, we talked quite a bit about what it means to have grit. What is that magic combination of passion and perseverance that helps all of us achieve our goals? So grab a cup of tea, a cup of coffee, whatever you need to get settled, and help you enjoy my conversation with Angela. Welcome, Angela.
Hello, Mark. It's good to see you again.
So, of course, I have to start off by asking the question, how are you feeling?
You know, Mark, I started every class this semester with your question, how are you feeling? And your mood meter. So with attribution and with gratitude, by the way, to you, how am I feeling? Well, I'm feeling pretty upper right quadrant, actually. I'm feeling pretty positive and, reasonably energetic, maybe not at the very, top part of the corner of the mood meter, but I'm feeling good.
You say you've been using the mood meter, and then you probably know from my teaching that you can't use the word good.
I know. And then you were like, and the follow-up question, but do you know what the second slide is after they do the mood meter? So we use like the little poll everywhere software, and then they put those on. And then the second slide is, in one word, how would you describe how you're feeling? So I have been listening to you. And so if I gave you one word to describe how I'm feeling right now, I feel a kind of excitement about this conversation. I have a sort of, eagerness to hear what you want to talk about, although I know about it in broad brushstrokes.
Just to get people acquainted with your work, and the focus of this webcast is on emotion regulation. You've studied grit, self-control, and I would just love for people to hear, like, from your brain, like, how do you think about emotion regulation?
I think it's about 12 years to the day that I met James Gross, who, and who's been part of this webcast family. And he studies emotion regulation, but I hadn't before. But where our paths intersected, and I think it's a way of answering your question, is that I was studying kids, and I was studying how kids regulate their effort. So you have a homework assignment. Do you do it? Do you finish it? Did you do it, right before it was due, or did you do it, several hours before it was due? I mean, how much did you study for your test? Did you pay attention in class? And as a former high school teacher, those questions of how people regulate their own effort toward goals that are maybe not immediately gratifying, but we all know are good for us in the long run. That's what I was studying. Then I met James those years ago at a conference, and I only then started thinking about emotion regulation. I was thinking about regulation in a different domain. But in those 12 years, I will tell you that I think feelings of anxiety, feelings of pride, feelings of curiosity, feelings of boredom, all these emotions that are actually part and parcel of being a young person in school, just thinking narrowly of academic work and academic goals. Wow, you can't actually regulate your effort towards your goals without actually regulating your feelings. So I'm now seeing how these are much more intertwined than I had in the early part of my career.
And so, but from your, the way you've thought about it, the way you've studied it, how do you think about emotion regulation and self-control?
I mean, I think self-control is a broader domain of can you regulate your effort? Can you regulate your attention? Can you regulate your feelings? Can you regulate what you're saying? I mean, self-control, broadly speaking, is when you have a conflict between two things that you could do, and one of them you really understand to be the better thing, to study, to go to bed, to not be on TikTok, to, do this, not do that. When that comes into conflict with an alternative, which is more immediately gratifying, like the impulse you have is in conflict with this longer term goal, that to me is what self-control is. And I think of regulating our feelings or our emotions when we choose to do that as being kind of one domain in which we exercise self-control. So that's how I would define those terms.
And so I always have a big question for people in your position. I get asked all the time, like, why are you so passionate about emotional intelligence? Why are you running around the world trying to get people to talk about their feelings? And so I'm really curious, for you, when did you have the aha, like, this is going to be my career? I'm going to study grit and self-control and all that stuff.
For me, it was when I was kind of failing as a teacher. So I taught kids in New York City, and then I taught kids in San Francisco, and then finally kids in Philadelphia, all public schools, and all math classes. Actually, that was my subject. And when I say failing as a teacher, I mean, I don't think I was a dumpster fire as a teacher, but there was a failure to motivate some of my students to reach their potential. I mean, you just have to sit next to a kid at lunch and be like, holy smokes, your brain is great. What a great young brain, which is generally true, right? I mean, think about like a kid's, physical like health, it's like, wow, they're new. Like, they can do things that I can't do because I'm older. And I feel like the same thing is true of their brains. I mean, generally they're these like shiny new brains that can learn so well and so fast. But as a teacher, I was often disappointed in what my students didn't do. And I learned eventually that disappointment should come home to me. It's not necessarily that like they weren't putting up their end of the bargain so much as I wasn't able to elicit from them all of the effort and therefore the learning that they could do. So that time in the classroom directly led me to get a PhD. I mean, it was immediately like following the epiphany that to understand how students can be successful requires that we understand their motivation. And I think that eventually leads you to emotions, right? Because then you're like, oh, why would somebody do something or not do something? But that was the epiphany for me. That's why I'm so passionate. It's because I used to be a teacher.
So you just saw the real application of it.
Yeah, the urgency and also not really knowing better what to do. I mean, I tried really hard. I did try really hard, but I think as psychologists now, Mark, you and myself both, hopefully there's more understanding, not just like exhortation and lecturing, but some understanding of why young people do what they do and therefore helping them more than we did if we didn't know that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so of all the research that you've done on grit and self-control and other concepts, like, what are you most proud of in terms of like, what finding do you think is the most important thing that everybody needs to know?
Well, okay, it's not really a humble brag, but I do want to start out with a little humility. I hope it's not a humble brag. When I started studying grit and it got a little bit of attention, right? I said from the beginning, and it is really true, grit does predict achievement. It does predict the achievement of very challenging goals. And by grit, I mean passion and perseverance sustained over the long term. So the humility is that if you ask me, what's the correlation? Like, how related is grit to achievement? Like, how well can we predict? I would say, only about 1% of the variation in achievement can be explained by grit. 99% is not related to grit, at least in the research studies that I've done. So the humble part of this is, the humility part of this is, I do think that grit is probably the most well-known of the things that I study. And I do believe it's true that people who achieve goals that take years or more to complete have this quality of passion and perseverance. And at the same time, the thing that I would also just say, Mark, is like, I don't know if everybody needs to hear that, doesn't need to hear that. But I want to be the one to say, it's not the only thing that determines whether you achieve those goals. Like where you're growing up, your zip code, your emotional intelligence. I mean, we've talked a little bit about how research, sometimes finds that things that are not grit are more predictive, curiosity, the match of what you're doing to your interests. So grit is what I am most well known for. What I do stand by is that what that research revealed to me is that if anyone is trying to do something that is worth doing in this world, it is going to take a tremendous amount of consistency and dedication. I stand by that, but I also don't want that to be exaggerated, to be like, oh, well, if someone doesn't succeed, well, then they must not have had grit, for example.
I think also what I've heard you say, and I want to reinforce, and catch me if I'm wrong here, is that I think my work on emotional intelligence, your work on grit, people think of it as like, it's fully on you to figure it out. I've come to the conclusion that, 99% of emotional intelligence is completely learned in context, like at home, school, communities. And I'm curious, do you feel the same about grit?
Yeah, I think there's two ways in which grit is not just about the individual. One is what you just said, which is, where do you think kids learn the habits and the mindsets that incline one to pursue something over a really long time? Like 100%, they learn it. They're encouraged. I've got two daughters. One's 22, one's 20 now, and of course, as a mom, I was thinking about a lot of things and not just grit, but oh my gosh, there was so much encouragement of thinking about their abilities as malleable, as thinking about the importance of interest. They learned about the flow state when they were little kids. I was like, why it's important to understand interest? Because nobody does anything very well unless they like it. Like your pupil should dilate when you're doing something. It's like, it's got to have some fun in it, So I agree twofold. One is because you need a certain surrounding in order to cultivate a quality like grit. But the second thing I want to say, and this is why it's a twofold agreement with you, Marc, even if you have grit already, you still need your environment to support the expression of the grit, right? Because human beings don't do things that are irrational. And I think when you find somebody who's working really hard, it's not irrational. And when you find somebody who's not working hard, it's also not irrational. You just have to figure out what the costs and benefits are for that person in their context.
I think also, one of the things is, we both work at pretty high-powered universities. And for me, oftentimes I see people who don't know the kind of best ways to express their grit. It's like that perseverance at no cost, which is...
Or at all costs.
Or at all costs, yeah.
Yeah. Either way, yeah.
It's just not working. It's like that. It's not working.
I think perseverance without passion is maybe what you're referring to. I mean, there are these like sort of white knuckled, anxious sort of like goal pursuit tides that we can get into, and then we look to our left and we look to our right, and everyone else seems to be paddling harder. Oh my gosh! But I think what a lot of these elite universities, including ours, what we don't do for students is allow them to, in a more relaxed way, explore their interests and their values. Like, what are you paddling towards, and like why? And I think this, I know we, violently agree that. That that's not the point of education. It's just to like, in this like panicked way, try to like tick off all the boxes. So I think perseverance without passion is just drudgery. And then passion without perseverance is like, you're not going to get anywhere. But I do think if you have, and certainly there are people who disagree, but that is why from the very beginning, I wanted to study the combination of loving what you do, and then being able to dedicate yourself to it.
Are there any particular strategies that you think are the most helpful for people, like on that pathway? Like what are the gritty strategies?
So here's something that I think a lot of young people misunderstand. And if I think back to when I was younger, I may have been a little late to this lesson as well. So there's a scientist named Arne Gulich, and I'm probably mispronouncing it incorrectly because I believe he's German, but he studied athletes, elite athletes. And the surprising finding is that when you look at the super elite athletes, those who are like Olympic level competitors, that if you look back into their childhood, they were late to specializing in their sport, not early to specialize, but late. And the reason why that's so surprising is, parents are like, oh, you should start when you're 5, you should start when you're 4, you should start when you're 3. Like, think about all the minutes of deliberate practice that you're going to miss when you don't start as early as the kids who you're competing with. And what Arne has found is that really it's sampling that enables you to find the thing that is a good fit with your interests. Also sampling, doing multiple sports. And there's lots of examples of this. Since I'm in Philadelphia, I would just say that Joel Embiid, who is our, MVP, he's, 76ers player, that he played, different sports. And in fact, he was, I think, a serious volleyball player. And I believe the story goes that he didn't even pick up a basketball for the first time until he was 17. So what happens in that sampling, maybe volleyball, maybe I'll do this, maybe I'll do that, is that you're finding fit. The other thing is you're learning a lot. Arnie said that the other thing that happens when you're a young person and you're trying out, what it's like to be in the drama club for, maybe don't like that so much. Maybe I'll try newspaper. Oh, maybe I'll get a job. You're also exposing yourself to experiences that you have to kind of integrate what the learnings are across these very diverse experiences. So I guess I'll say the thing that to me is the most useful thing to say to a young person, because it's the stage in which they are, and also because I think it works against certain myths about what makes people successful, is that earlier in life you have to you have to sample a lot, and that means quitting things. So paradoxically, the secret to sustaining a commitment is to be very flexible, especially when you're young.
Thank you for that. I've been doing a lot of thinking lately. It's been, you studied with Marty back in the day, and the positive psychology movement, has been around for about 30 years. I was a positive psychology fellow back in the day. And then, I've been obviously involved in the work on emotional intelligence by my mentor, Peter and Jack. And so it's 30, 35 years. We've had all the science. There's more papers, published on the predictive validity of these concepts, et cetera, randomized trials showing outcomes. But yet, you look at the current state of our country, the world, and you see in many ways, anxiety is at the highest, depression at this high. There were 80 school shootings last year. Climate change, people are worried about a lot of things. And so I've been, questioning, like, have we created is it a broken promise? Has our field, made a promise that has not been able to be fulfilled? And I'm just curious from your perspective, what do you think about that? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't think we can lay blame, and I don't think you are, but I don't think we can lay blame at the feet of psychologists who work on emotional well-being and other aspects of the good life. I mean, I don't think those scientists are responsible for climate change or for even the rising tide of depression and anxiety, which I think has to do with lots of secular trends that are not at all related to that. I do think that there is an unfulfilled promise. So I think, this webcast is part of what I hope to be like a tidal wave of work towards emotional literacy, psychological literacy more broadly. I think there's an urgent need. I think of Ruler as being, a pioneer in this domain, but the fact that like not every school has any kind of curriculum or formal guidance for young people about like how to understand and manage their emotions, how to set goals and make plans, how to make sense of failure and risk taking. I mean, those are lessons that a lot of people would say, oh, they don't need that because, the school of life, right? But the school of life is really inefficient. And I think these trends that you just named are evidence that, just letting people like figure it out on their own, with all the inventions that human beings have created, like these. And so like, I think we should do what we do for kids when we want them to learn calculus, which is to help them learn calculus and not expect them to figure it out all on their own. So I agree. There's an unfulfilled promise, and I'm still optimistic that there can be the fulfillment of that, but not if we just like keep things on as the status quo.
Yeah, I think we're fully aligned there. For me, it's an implementation problem. Like we have the knowledge, we have the concepts that we have created that we know work, and the people who, in the randomized trials where we, engage, that the people who are in the intervention groups do better than in the control groups. But yet those are, when you look at the numbers of children or teachers that are in those
tiny,
trials
right?
compared to
compared to everyone. So that's your answer to it, is that it's an implementation problem. And what's the solution then? Like, what's the solution to the implementation problem?
I think it's about the messaging. I think that we have honestly, I think it's at a macro level that policies are not supportive of these concepts.
And they somehow become politicized too. Like, when did that happen? Like, I was sitting next to, I'm not even going to say where I was sitting next to this person. I was like, how do I de-identify this person? I was sitting next to a human at an event that I will not describe, but she was incensed that her daughter went to a school where their daughter had to answer a survey about how she was feeling. And then, all in one breath, this very unhappy mother was telling me about, and I don't want her to be answered questions about her identity and her, her gender. And I mean, it's just like, she kept going. Right. And I was like, okay, whoa, hold on. First of all, there's a lot here. And also, like, so when did it become a political anything to help kids understand their emotions? I was like, oh, I have to say that I don't have a problem with young people learning to express how they're feeling. And I don't even have a problem. I don't know, this is going to maybe be not what you want to hear. I'm saying this to my seatmate at a dinner, like that, like, I think it's okay for kids to say how they're feeling in a survey. Like, that goes to the, like, so we had a conversation about that, but I don't know what happened. Maybe everything becomes political these days, but I think that to me is a complete tragedy. If we would let political division get in the way of our kids, feeling like they're not able to, talk about things like their feelings, like, that's a big step backward.
I think that the more we, help people see it as a skill that helps people achieve in life, well-being.
It's not, there's no hidden Trojan horse agenda. I'm just really just trying to help people with this skill that we all had to learn, right? And that we're all still learning.
So we're going to jump to a little more personal. All of us have mindsets. We grew up with mindsets. We had people who raised us, teachers who taught us. And so I'm going to ask you to just take a moment and reflect on your childhood. I hope that's not something that is triggering for you. And if you were to create the title for the movie that would describe what you learned about emotions growing up, how would you title the movie?
Such a great question. I guess I would call it, At Least We Don't Have to Worry About Angela. And so when I was growing up, my dad, I was the youngest of three. And like every family, there was plenty of complexity. And I was arguably, of the three of us, at least from my parents and especially my dad's vantage point, like the one who didn't have to get worried about at night, right? Because it's like, she's fine. Probably would have said like, we don't have to worry about Angie, because that's the nickname I grew up by. And so I think what I learned about feeling was that happiness is good and everything else is not so good. And the kindest thing that you can do for other people is to be happy and not much else. And so I did learn, I think, to be happy, to certainly express happiness. And I felt like when I expressed anything other than that, that there was a kind of burdening, that I was like kind of being selfish, because it's like, oh, well, I'm going to give you my anxiety or my unhappiness, my sadness.
All right. So to take this kind of another level down or deeper, obviously, because you were generous to give me a nice blurb from my book, Permission to Feel, I spoke about my Uncle Marvin, who was the person, who was a teacher who, I had two parents who loved me. Neither one of them really knew much about feelings and couldn't deal with their own feelings. But yet Uncle Marvin came into my life and really made a difference in terms of being the person with whom I could speak about my feelings. Now, what you don't know is that for the last 3 years, I've been doing surveys, and I have about 50,000 people who I studied. And I asked them that simple question. Did you have an Uncle Marvin? Was there someone when you were growing up that gave you the permission to feel? I call it a feelings mentor. And so I'm just curious, did you have a feelings mentor? Was there someone maybe outside of your family or in your family who just created that space for you?
I don't think I had a feelings mentor until I had a therapist when I was like 41. And wow, there was a lot of work to do. It's like, oh, it's okay to not feel, like happy. It's like, it's okay to, need to take care of myself. I don't think I actually had a feelings mentor. I don't think I had someone like you did who really modeled for me a like true permission to, feel what I was feeling. I can certainly point to many important mentors but I'll just say that wow, there was a lot of work to do when I first started therapy, and, very glad that I did, but 41's kind of late.
Well, it's never too late. It's interesting you say that because, what the data are showing thus far, it's in a pretty large, diverse sample. Only 30% of people who are who participated say they had someone.
Oh, interesting. So I'm in the majority.
Yeah. It's pretty remarkable. And when I talk to parents about this, they're like, well, that's not my job. I should, I'm like, okay, so you're like outsourcing the feelings mentor?
Right. Yes. Right.
It's like, get a tutor, get a feelings mentor. And there's a fear. There's a fear about this. And since we were talking about kids a lot, maybe we'll just go there for a moment, which is that what a lot of parents tell me is they don't want to ask their kids how they're feeling because they're afraid of what they'll hear.
Of the answer, right.
And what they'll do about it in that moment.
Yeah. The question that you asked me immediately led me to think, oh, what about my kids? What would be the title of their movie? And, would they say they have a feelings mentor? And would they say that I'm one of their, feelings mentors? And, of course I would want to say yes. I do think that since my kids were young, when I started to really get more in touch with my feelings and okay with expressing them and understanding them, naming them, all things that you write about in your book, I do think that I've done a better job, and you can interview them and ask them yourselves. But we have had conversations where, I hang up the phone and I think I never had a conversation like that when I was their age, or younger, where they could just tell me, and there wasn't problem solving, there wasn't advice giving, it was just listening, and I remember one of these conversations not too long ago. Lucy, the younger daughter, said, Mom, I feel better just that I was able to talk to you. And I know we didn't really figure anything out, but I don't know why. And I said, I don't think I fully understand why either, but isn't that so true? When we're able to say something and not be judged and not be hurried along toward a solution, it's kind of great. So I think there's progress across generations. I will say that.
I think so too. I'm hoping so. It's funny, all those adjectives that you use. So in my research, I'm finding the top 3 characteristics of our feelings mentors are non-judgmental, good listeners, and compassionate. It's funny because I always look at I've had thousands of people now that I make my little Wordle, and nowhere does it say fixer.
Right. Right. Problem solver, efficient. Yeah, no, that's so interesting. And I think there's emerging research out of Mike McCullough's lab that if you, there are all those questionnaires about empathy, and obviously empathy is the foundation for ethics and morality. And, that's, I think the angle that they began investigating, and maybe different from where you started, but they had this desire to come up with or to identify the single most useful item on a questionnaire to measure empathy. And of course, I wanted to know what it was. The long presentation and all the factor analysis. And I think it's some version of are you compassionate? So that that coming out as one of your three things, like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
It's less cognitive and it's more showing up. It's doing.
Yeah. It's definitely not, the same thing as analytical intelligence, for example.
Or just like, I always joke that, with empathy, I'm very cognitive as a person. So like, I'm in a restaurant with my partner and I'm watching like things happening, let's say with a kid and a parent, and the kid is rocking in their chair. And I'm thinking like, gosh, what kind of parents are they? Are they paying attention? Like, what's going on? And Horacio, my husband, is like, he's already captured the kid.
Yeah.
I just sit there wondering and like thinking,
and like, right. The little numbers are like spilling down over the spreadsheets in your head. Like, yeah, no, it is different. And I think sometimes, as my therapist reminds me, like when we live life with our head, like I think I've had a lot of therapists, by the way. And like one of them was like, you don't want to be living life in your head. Like, you're everything below the neck doesn't matter, that like, you're just like a brain on a stick kind of thing. Anyway, so yeah, +1 to that.
I appreciate that. All right. So as we have a couple of minutes left, I want to just learn from you strategies that have been helpful for you that other people might apply. So firstly, over the last couple of years, any particular emotions that you've struggled with?
Oh, last year, like the year before this academic year for me was like a low point, I think a nadir of my professional confidence. I had a sabbatical year, so I wasn't teaching at university for the fall and the spring, and I was supposed to write a book. And then I worked so hard. I worked from before dawn till, I couldn't work anymore, to like drop into bed 7 days a week. And it went terribly. And I didn't finish the book. And I don't know, there was some like disastrous effect on my confidence. I told my husband I was retiring, and like, he was like, really? He's like, you're only 53. And I was like, I'm not a good professor. I'm not a good psychologist. Like I can't like write anymore. Anyway, so I'll tell you that all happened. And I can't think of another time in my life that's been that, hard professionally. But strategy wise, I wrote a lot in my journal. I started therapy again. I like literally called up my therapist and was like, I don't know if you even practice anymore, but like, do you remember me? And so I started therapy again. I leaned hard on my partner, on my husband, Jason, and found him to be a sponge with infinite capacity for all of my tears. I called my mom a lot. I remember my mom, who's, now in her late 80s, said, and she must have been saying this in response to what I was saying. She was like, it's not a failure, it's a process. I remember that quote. I was like, and I must have been telling her that I felt like a failure. So I did a lot of support seeking. And I think the one lesson I would learn from like, why is it helpful to write in a journal, talk to a therapist, talk to your partner, and call your mom? I think they all of these strategies had one thing in common, is it helped me get some perspective. And for me, what I learned last year is that basically I had my nose against the wall and I was like, this is terrible. I can't, and like life is over and I'm useless. And then all you needed to do was like to move away from the wall and be like, oh, but I'm a daughter and a friend. And like, honestly, the world doesn't care that much about a second book from me. Like it doesn't. The world's going to keep spinning. But that perspective was to me only possible with the aid of, mostly other people. I think the journal writing was helpful because like, who else are you going to talk to at like 2 a.m? But to me, it's like, it was all about perspective. And I'm really trying hard to put things in my life to like keep perspective, like just kind of doorstops so that I don't end up like, getting all myopic again.
It's, I think people, when I tell people, that I've struggled with my anxiety for 54 years, like, really? You're having anxiety? I'm like, yeah, I've just mastered strategies, and perspective taking is a big one, and social support is another one, and working out is another one, and meditating
that's a good one.
And yeah. Actually, that's been my strategy for the last year. I'm like I'm also writing a book, and there are days I'm just like, I am incompetent. I have no ideas. Nothing's original. And then I just go work out, and I'm like, at least I'll have a good body at the end.
Yeah, exactly. Check out these abs. Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think that is like a meta lesson, right? Like, nobody would expect that you would have anxiety. Nobody, I think, would meet me and be like, oh, I bet she's had I said to my lab manager, on a scale from 0 to 10, my confidence is -3. That's what I said to her last year. And it's no longer that, but I think it's like, why? Because, strategies, right? Like, so this idea that emotional intelligence, your idea that emotional intelligence is a skill. It's a skill that you're not born knowing, but like baseball or calculus or swimming or anything else like that you could learn. That to me is not obvious, and so true. And it's helped me a lot even to understand that it's a skill because, it puts you in the position of like constantly learning. I hope I'm learning. That last year taught me some valuable lessons.
So in regard to strategies, do you think that perspective taking piece, as you said, whether it be journaling or speaking with others, is like one of your like go-to strategies now?
It is. The meta lesson that like when I get into trouble, I don't want to say for other people, but when I get into trouble, I think it's often lack of perspective. And then the question is like, how do I get more perspective? Because when you're there, I think you don't realize it. I remember writing things in my journal and I was like, I've thought about it and I know the following. And now I read those pages and I'm like, what delusional person wrote this? So I think the problem with perspective taking is you don't always know that you need it when you're in the middle of not having it. And so, now like a little wiser, I'm kind of like, I met with my therapist today and I was like, I want to thank you, Dee, for like being with me this year. And I feel like one of the things I learned is that like, thinking about your emotions, talking to a therapist, talking about things like this, it's not just for crises. I was like, I'm not going to make the mistake again of only thinking like if the house is on fire, like then you need to, I'm like, and she said, I think it's a wonderful, she said something very D-like, she's like, I think it's a wonderful thing that you've come to that insight. And I've loved working with you on that. But yeah, I think when you're in the midst of not having perspective, sometimes you don't have the ability to see the problem.
Yeah. A few last things. First is when you want to be in that yellow quadrant, excited, jubilant, ecstatic, what's your strategy?
I feel very excited about a couple of things right now. One is Lipton Yellow Label Tea. Game changer. Like when I wake up in the morning, I think of 3 good things. I look up and the first thing I see above my head is this painting that my mom did when she was 24 years old. And I look up and I look at this one little sailboat and I think of 3 good things. And then I think, oh my gosh, I get to have a cup of Lipton Yellow Maple Tea, which I will send you a box of, Mark. So it's the small things, I think, sometimes like that. And then, and the second thing is I've realized like one of my greatest, I would guess I call it a vice, but just like, oh my gosh, if I could do this, it's just taking a walk. Like I really like walking. I like walking as much as I hate being in a car. And so I am very happy that both Lipton Yellow Label Tea and walking are affordable kind of, indulgences that don't do the climate any harm, especially if you compost your tea bags. So yeah, I'm excited about those. And those put me in the top right quadrant. If you do both of them, then I'm like, sailing.
Well, you certainly have a lot of energy.
I had a cup of Lipton Yellow Label Tea, actually. I feel like, yeah.
All right. So now it's the opposite. You want to be calm, content, tranquil, peaceful, relaxed, at ease. What's your go-to strategy? So
I think my favorite way to unwind is watching, Ted Lasso's over, which is very sad for me, but watching something like, The Crown or whatever the thing is that we're watching on Netflix, and then like sort of laying down starfish style, and then my husband gives me a back rub, and like, yeah, very awesome.
That sounds pretty good. All right, final question, and then I know you have to go. I'd like you to just take a moment, imagine a world where everyone, policymakers, leaders, teachers, students, parents, are learning the skills that we've been talking about. What do you see? What's different?
Mark, I have long believed that, and I have long said that if every child in the world lived a life in which there was a psychologically wise adult, right? Like the whole world would be better. It would be greener. There would be less war. There would be, food more equitably distributed. So I think if you just imagine that not only we ourselves, but the people around us have these skills to recognize their emotions, including the negative ones, to be able to observe them in a non-judgmental way and then manage them when they need to manage them. I mean, I really do think it would be a world with more peace and less war. I think it would be more productive for those in the, wait, but how's it going to grow the GDP and raise incomes? I think people would be much more productive. And I think they would be so much, there would be kind of this thing that we all really ultimately want, which is it would be a happier place. Like we would be a happier species. And, maybe we're both optimists. Like you said, maybe we haven't done so well in the last 30 or so years, but, I'm optimistic that the future could hold exactly that vision.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. Great to see you. Obviously, people are going to want to know how to find you. So can you just tell us where they can do that?
I have a website called angeladuckworth.com, and you can find me there.
Angela, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Marc. I'll see you again.
That concludes this episode of Dealing with Feelings with Dr. Angela Duckworth. I hope you enjoyed. Please make sure to leave some comments or suggestions. And importantly for me, I want to know, are you using these strategies? What's working for you? What are some of your successes? What are some of the failures, challenges? Let us know it all. I also want to encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can get more episodes. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing you on the next one.